History isn't just about kings and battles, though those stories certainly have their place. No, history is something far more intimate and mysterious than the grand narratives we learned in school. It's about people, real people who lived and breathed and worried about their daily bread, who watched their children grow, who whispered stories by flickering candlelight. It's about entire societies that simply vanished one day, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions. It's about precious diamonds that disappeared into the chaos of war, never to be seen again. It's about strange epidemics that gripped medieval convents, where nuns would suddenly begin biting each other in fits of inexplicable frenzy. These are the stories that lurk in the margins of history books, the ones that make us pause and wonder what really happened all those centuries ago. They remind us that the past wasn't just a series of neat, orderly events leading inevitably to our present moment. Instead, it was messy and strange and full of mysteries that we may never fully understand. In this journey together, we'll explore the odd corners and forgotten chambers of our shared human story. We'll walk through abandoned Norse settlements in Greenland, where families once thrived for 400 years before disappearing completely. We'll sit at medieval tables and discover what peasants really ate, dispelling myths that have persisted for generations. We'll investigate the curious case of thieves' guilds that probably never existed except in the imagination of a Spanish storyteller named Miguel de Cervantes. We'll witness the bizarre spectacle of nuns in 15th century German convents caught in the grip of a contagious madness that spread across Europe like wildfire. We'll examine the strange employment crisis that plagued ancient Rome, where most citizens lived without regular work while bread and circuses kept them fed and entertained. We'll follow the legendary Viking leader known as Ivar the Boneless, whose very nickname remains a puzzle that historians debate to this day. We'll separate the reality of medieval Japanese ninja from the black-clad assassins of popular culture, and we'll search for traces of the magnificent Florentine diamond, a 137-carat yellow gem that vanished during the chaos of the First World War and has never been found. These stories don't always have clean endings or satisfying explanations. Sometimes the evidence leads us down paths that simply end in darkness, leaving us with more questions than answers. But perhaps that's exactly what makes them so compelling. They remind us that history is not a closed book with all its secrets revealed. Instead, it's a living mystery, full of gaps and shadows where imagination must fill in what facts cannot provide. So settle in and let your mind wander back through time to places and moments that feel both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. These are the hidden chapters of human experience, the strange histories that reveal as much about ourselves today as they do about the people who lived them long ago. In the spaces between what we know and what we can only guess, we find something profound about the human condition itself. Picture a harsh landscape of ice and stone, where the aurora borealis dances across endless winter nights and the summer sun barely sets. This is Greenland, the world's largest island, a place that seems almost hostile to human life. Yet for over 4 centuries, Norse settlers not only survived here but actually thrived, building communities, raising families, and creating a civilization thousands of miles from their Scandinavian homeland. Their story begins in the year 985, when a man named Eric the Red led the first wave of Norse colonists across the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. Eric wasn't exactly a model citizen back in Iceland. He'd been exiled for killing a neighbor in a blood feud, a not uncommon occurrence in those violent times. But exile often bred exploration in the Viking world, and Eric's punishment became the foundation for one of history's most remarkable colonial experiments. Eric had heard rumors of a vast land to the west, glimpsed by earlier sailors blown off course during storms. When his 3 years of exile began, he decided to investigate these stories personally. What he found was indeed a massive island, though hardly the green paradise his promotional name suggested. Still, there were pockets of habitable land along the southwestern coast, areas where grass grew thick during the brief summer months and fjords provided natural harbors for Viking longships. When Eric returned to Iceland, he brought with him tales of fertile valleys and abundant hunting grounds. He called his discovery Greenland, perhaps as an early example of creative marketing, hoping to attract settlers with a name that promised prosperity. Whether people believed his optimistic description or simply trusted in Eric's reputation as a survivor, nearly 400 colonists joined him on the return voyage in 986. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing poverty. Many were established farmers and craftsmen who sold their Icelandic properties to fund their Greenlandic adventure. They brought cattle, sheep, goats, and even a few pigs. They packed their ships with everything needed to establish permanent settlements, including tools, seeds, household goods, and perhaps most importantly, their traditional Norse culture and Christian faith. The colonists established two main settlements along Greenland's southwestern coast. The larger one, which they called the Eastern Settlement, stretched along what is now known as the Julianahab district. Here, in a series of fjords and valleys, they built about 250 farms, several churches, and even a cathedral. The Western Settlement, smaller but still substantial, lay about 300 miles to the north and contained roughly 90 farms. Life in Greenland required considerable adaptation. The growing season was shorter than anything they'd experienced in Iceland or Norway. Grain crops were nearly impossible, so they focused on livestock, particularly cattle and sheep that could graze on the summer grass and survive on stored hay during the long winter months. They hunted seals, walruses, and occasionally polar bears. They fished in the fjords and collected birds' eggs from coastal cliffs. Perhaps most importantly, they discovered that Greenland offered something highly valued in medieval Europe: ivory. Walrus tusks and narwhal tusks brought excellent prices in European markets, providing the Greenlanders with a crucial export commodity. They also trapped Arctic foxes for their luxurious white pelts and collected eiderdown, the incredibly warm feathers from Arctic ducks. For several centuries, this harsh but sustainable economy supported a thriving Norse community. Archaeological evidence suggests that at their peak, the Greenland settlements housed between 3,000 and 5,000 people. They maintained regular contact with Iceland and Norway. Ships arrived each summer carrying essential goods like iron, timber, and grain that Greenland couldn't produce. These same ships carried Greenlandic exports back to European markets. The Greenlanders built impressive stone churches, some large enough to hold several hundred worshippers. They carved elaborate decorative elements from local soapstone and imported stained glass windows from Europe. They created a functioning government based on traditional Norse law and elected their own parliamentary assembly. They even sent representatives to Iceland and Norway on diplomatic missions. But perhaps most remarkably, they maintained their Norse identity and Christian faith despite their isolation. When the Catholic Church established a bishopric in Greenland in the early 1200s, the colonists welcomed their first bishop with celebration. They paid their church taxes faithfully, sending walrus ivory and polar bear pelts to Rome. They built a cathedral in the Eastern Settlement that rivaled many European churches in its ambition and craftsmanship. Yet for all their apparent success, something began to go wrong in the 1400s. The last reliable record of contact between Greenland and the outside world dates to 1410, when a ship returned to Norway carrying news that a wedding had been celebrated in the Greenland cathedral. After that, silence. Ships that attempted to reach Greenland in subsequent decades found empty settlements. Houses stood abandoned but largely intact, as if their occupants had simply walked away one day and never returned. Personal belongings remained scattered about, suggesting that whatever happened, it wasn't a planned evacuation. Animals roamed free in overgrown farmyards. Churches stood open to the elements, their wooden roofs beginning to sag. What happened to 4 centuries of Norse civilization in Greenland remains one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. The mystery deepens when we consider that these people had survived ice ages, famines, and countless harsh winters before. They'd adapted to one of Earth's most challenging environments and built a sustainable society that lasted longer than most European kingdoms. Several theories attempt to explain their disappearance. The most widely accepted involves climate change. Starting around 1300, Earth entered what historians call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped significantly across the North Atlantic region. Pack ice expanded, making sea voyages to Greenland increasingly dangerous. The growing season shortened even further, putting additional pressure on already marginal agriculture. As temperatures fell, the sea ice that had once been seasonal became permanent in many areas. Ships from Iceland and Norway found it increasingly difficult to reach Greenland's harbors. Trade connections that had sustained the colony for centuries began to falter. Without regular imports of iron and grain, maintaining their European lifestyle became nearly impossible. The cooling climate also seems to have triggered changes in ocean currents and fish populations. Species that the Greenlanders had relied upon for centuries moved to different waters. Seal hunting, a crucial source of both food and materials, became less productive. Even the walruses that provided their most valuable export commodity became scarce in traditional hunting grounds. But climate change alone might not have doomed the colony. Other theories suggest that cultural rigidity played a crucial role in their downfall. The Greenlanders had maintained their Norse identity with remarkable tenacity, continuing to build European-style stone houses even when local materials and conditions favored different construction methods. They persisted in trying to raise cattle when reindeer or seals might have provided more reliable nutrition. Most significantly, they seem to have had limited interaction with the Inuit peoples who had been successfully adapting to Greenland's environment for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests minimal trade or cultural exchange between the Norse and Inuit communities. The Greenlanders apparently never adopted Inuit hunting techniques, clothing styles, or survival strategies that might have helped them weather the climate crisis. Some historians propose that conflict with the Inuit hastened the Norse decline. As resources became scarcer due to climate change, competition for hunting grounds might have led to warfare. The Norse were formidable fighters in open battle, but they were outnumbered and less adapted to Arctic conditions. Sustained conflict could have gradually worn down their population. Alternatively, the disappearance might not have been as sudden or complete as it appears. Some evidence suggests that at least some Greenlanders survived into the 1500s, gradually intermarrying with Inuit communities and losing their distinct Norse identity. DNA studies of modern Greenlandic populations have found traces of European ancestry that might support this theory. The economic factor cannot be ignored either. By the 1400s, the European market for walrus ivory was declining as African elephant ivory became more available through expanding trade networks. The Crusades had opened new routes to Asian and African luxury goods, making Arctic products less exotic and valuable. Without their primary export commodity, the Greenlanders couldn't afford the imported goods their lifestyle required. Political changes in Europe also isolated the colony. Norway itself came under Danish rule in the late 1300s, and the new government showed less interest in maintaining expensive connections with distant Greenland. The Hanseatic League's growing control over North Atlantic trade routes may have further marginalized Greenlandic commerce. Disease offers another possible explanation. Isolated populations often lack immunity to diseases that are common elsewhere. Ships arriving from Europe might have inadvertently introduced epidemics that devastated the small Greenlandic population. Without detailed medical records, we can only speculate about what diseases might have struck and how severely they affected the colony. The mystery of Greenland's vanished Norse population continues to fascinate archaeologists and historians. Modern excavations have revealed remarkably well-preserved remains of their settlements, frozen in time by the Arctic climate. Clothing, tools, wooden objects, and even organic materials have survived in conditions that would have destroyed them elsewhere. These archaeological treasures tell us much about how the Greenlanders lived, but they cannot explain why they disappeared. We know they were skilled farmers, accomplished craftsmen, and devout Christians who maintained their faith for 4 centuries in one of the world's most challenging environments. We know they created beautiful art, built impressive architecture, and maintained complex trade relationships across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean. What we don't know is why such a resilient and adaptable people finally succumbed to pressures they had weathered many times before. Perhaps it was a combination of all these factors: climate change, cultural inflexibility, economic disruption, disease, and conflict, creating a perfect storm of challenges that even the hardy Greenlanders couldn't survive. Their story serves as a sobering reminder that even successful civilizations can vanish without warning. The Norse Greenlanders left behind stone churches and carefully tended graveyards, evidence of people who clearly intended to stay forever. Yet within a few decades, 4 centuries of human presence simply ended. leaving only empty houses and unanswered questions beneath the Arctic sky. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval English village on a crisp autumn morning. Smoke rises from thatched cottages as families begin their daily routines. The air carries the scent of baking bread, the sound of chickens pecking in dooryard gardens, and the distant lowing of cattle in common pastures. This is a world we think we know from countless books and movies, a world of desperate hunger and grinding poverty where peasants scraped by on crusts of moldy bread and thin gruel. But what if that familiar image is almost entirely wrong? What if medieval peasants, while certainly not living in luxury, enjoyed a more varied and nutritious diet than popular culture would have us believe? Recent historical research has begun to paint a remarkably different picture of medieval food culture, one that challenges many of our most persistent assumptions about life in the Middle Ages. The truth about medieval peasant diets is far more complex and interesting than the simple narrative of constant starvation. While these people certainly faced food insecurity and seasonal shortages, their daily meals were often more substantial and varied than we might expect. They developed sophisticated strategies for food preservation, storage, and preparation that allowed them to maintain reasonable nutrition even in challenging circumstances. Let's begin with bread, the cornerstone of medieval peasant nutrition. Far from being an occasional luxury, bread formed the foundation of every meal. A typical adult peasant consumed between 2 and 3 pounds of bread daily, an amount that would seem enormous by modern standards. This wasn't the refined white bread of today's bakeries, but a coarse, dark loaf made from whatever grains were available. Wheat when times were good, but more often rye, barley, oats, or mixtures of different cereals. The quality of bread varied significantly with social status and economic conditions. Wealthy peasants might enjoy bread made primarily from wheat, while poorer families relied on barley bread or even loaves that included peas, beans, or acorns ground into flour. During particularly difficult years, bread might incorporate ingredients that sound unappetizing today but provided crucial nutrition: crushed nuts, dried peas, or even ground tree bark. But bread was never eaten alone. The medieval peasant meal centered around pottage, a thick stew that was constantly simmering over the household fire. Pottage was essentially whatever vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat could be thrown into a large iron pot and cooked until tender. The contents varied by season, region, and family circumstances, but pottage provided the variety and nutrition that bread alone could not supply. A typical pottage might include cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, and whatever other vegetables the family garden produced. Herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme added flavor and medicinal benefits. When available, small amounts of bacon, salt pork, or even fresh meat might be added, though meat was not an everyday ingredient for most peasant families. The resulting stew was hearty, filling, and surprisingly nutritious, providing protein, vitamins, and minerals that kept families healthy through long working days. Seasonal variation played a crucial role in peasant diets. Spring brought fresh greens like dandelion leaves, nettle tops, and early herbs that helped combat the vitamin deficiencies of winter. Summer meant an abundance of vegetables from kitchen gardens: peas, beans, cabbages, turnips, carrots, and onions. Autumn was harvest time not just for grains, but for nuts, berries, and fruits that could be dried or preserved for winter consumption. Winter meals relied heavily on preserved foods. Vegetables were pickled in salt brine, dried or stored in root cellars. Meat was salted, smoked, or preserved in fat. Fish, particularly herring, was salted and packed in barrels. These preservation techniques, developed over centuries of necessity, allowed peasant families to maintain varied diets even when fresh food was unavailable. Protein sources were more diverse than popular stereotypes suggest. While fresh meat was indeed expensive and often reserved for special occasions, peasants had access to eggs from their chickens, milk and cheese from their cows or goats, and fish from local streams and ponds. Many peasant families kept pigs, which could be slaughtered in autumn and preserved to provide protein throughout the winter months. Ale was the standard beverage for all ages, not because medieval people were constantly drunk, but because brewing made water safer to drink. The brewing process killed harmful bacteria, and the alcohol content was typically much lower than modern beer. A typical peasant consumed several pints of ale daily, providing both hydration and calories. Children drank a weaker version called small ale that contained even less alcohol. The medieval agricultural calendar shaped eating patterns in ways that seem foreign to our modern experience of year-round food availability. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, wasn't just a religious observance but a practical response to late winter food shortages. During these weeks when fresh food was scarcest, religious restrictions on meat consumption aligned with economic necessity. Peasants ate more fish, eggs when permitted, and relied heavily on preserved foods. Feast days provided crucial breaks in this routine, times when communities came together to share better food and celebrate. Harvest festivals, Christmas celebrations, and local saints' days meant opportunities to slaughter animals, share expensive ingredients like spices or white flour, and enjoy foods that were otherwise beyond individual family budgets. These communal meals helped ensure that even the poorest community members occasionally enjoyed richer fare. Regional differences were significant in medieval diets. Peasants living near the coast had access to fresh and preserved fish that inland families might never taste. Those in forested areas could supplement their diets with game, nuts, and wild berries. Families near rivers or streams had freshwater fish and could operate mills that provided better flour. These geographic advantages often made the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine hardship. The medieval peasant kitchen was a marvel of efficiency and resourcefulness. Nothing was wasted that could be eaten or used in food preparation. Vegetable peelings went into pottage. Bones were boiled for broth. Stale bread was soaked in ale or milk to make a dish called sops. Even grain that was too poor for bread making could be boiled into porridge or fermented into ale. Cooking methods were necessarily simple but effective. Most peasant homes had only one hearth with a fire that was kept burning constantly. Iron pots suspended over the flames could simmer pottage all day while bread baked on flat stones or in communal ovens. Meat was roasted on spits or cooked in the same pot with vegetables. This one-pot cooking method meant that flavors blended together, creating complex and satisfying meals from simple ingredients. Seasonal work patterns affected eating schedules significantly. During harvest time, peasants might eat 4 or 5 times daily to fuel their intensive labor. In winter, when work was lighter and food stores were being conserved, 2 substantial meals might suffice. The main meal was typically eaten around midday, with a lighter supper in the evening. Breakfast, when eaten at all, was usually bread and ale consumed quickly before beginning work. Gardens attached to peasant cottages were crucial sources of fresh food. These small plots, often just a few square yards, were intensively cultivated with vegetables, herbs, and sometimes fruit trees. Women typically managed these gardens, using techniques passed down through generations to maximize production in minimal space. A well-tended peasant garden could provide a surprising variety of fresh food throughout the growing season. The preservation of food was both an art and a necessity. Peasant women developed remarkable skills in making food last through winter months and times of scarcity. Vegetables were dried, pickled, or stored in sand or straw. Fruits were made into preserves or dried into leather like sheets. Meat was salted, smoked over wood fires, or packed in fat to exclude air. These techniques required considerable knowledge and skill, representing centuries of accumulated wisdom about food safety and nutrition. Social aspects of medieval eating were quite different from modern family meal patterns. Peasant families often ate from a common pot, sharing wooden bowls and spoons. Bread served as both food and plate, with stews and other dishes eaten on thick slices that absorbed flavors and were consumed as part of the meal. This communal eating style reflected both practical necessity and cultural values that emphasized sharing and community cooperation. Religious influences on medieval diets extended far beyond Lent. The Catholic Church designated numerous fast days throughout the year when meat consumption was forbidden. These restrictions led to creative cooking with fish, eggs, dairy products, and vegetables. Peasants developed elaborate recipes for fish dishes and egg-based foods that provided variety during these restricted periods. Some historians argue that these religious dietary rules actually improved medieval nutrition by forcing greater dietary diversity. Market days brought opportunities for peasant families to trade surplus produce for items they couldn't grow or make themselves. A family with extra eggs might trade them for salt, an essential preservative. Those with surplus vegetables could exchange them for metal tools, pottery, or cloth. These market exchanges created networks of mutual support that helped communities weather bad harvests or other disasters. The contrast between medieval peasant diets and those of the nobility was certainly significant, but perhaps not as extreme as popular culture suggests. While lords and ladies enjoyed white bread, fresh meat, exotic spices, and elaborate preparations, the basic nutritional needs of peasants were often adequately met by their simpler fare. In some ways, the peasant diet of varied vegetables, whole grains, and moderate amounts of meat and dairy might have been healthier than the rich, heavily spiced cuisine of the wealthy. Seasonal celebrations centered around food reflected the agricultural calendar and provided psychological relief from the routines of subsistence living. Harvest festivals celebrated successful grain harvests with communal feasts featuring the best of the year's production. Christmas meant slaughtering animals that couldn't be fed through winter, creating temporary abundance of fresh meat. Easter marked the end of Lent's dietary restrictions with eggs, dairy products, and other foods that had been forbidden during the fasting period. The medieval peasant diet, when viewed honestly and completely, reveals a food culture that was far more sophisticated and varied than our stereotypes suggest. While these people certainly faced challenges and periodic shortages that we can barely imagine, they also developed sustainable food systems that supported large populations for centuries. Their deep knowledge of seasonal eating, food preservation, and community cooperation offers lessons that remain relevant in our modern world of global food chains and processed ingredients. Understanding medieval peasant diets reminds us that human societies have always found ways to create meaning, community, and even pleasure around the basic necessity of eating. Despite material limitations that would seem unbearable today, these communities developed rich food traditions that sustained both body and spirit through the cycles of scarcity and abundance that defined their lives. In the shadowy corners of our imagination, medieval cities harbor secret societies of criminals operating with the structure and legitimacy of legitimate trades. We picture underground headquarters where master thieves train apprentices in the arts of lockpicking and stealth, where guild halls echo with the planning of elaborate heists, and where honor among thieves creates a parallel world of criminal organization. This romantic vision of the Thieves' Guild has captured our collective imagination for centuries, appearing in countless stories, games, and films that draw inspiration from medieval settings. But what if this entire concept, so deeply embedded in our cultural understanding of medieval crime, is nothing more than an elaborate fiction? What if the Thieves' Guild, that cornerstone of fantasy literature and popular medieval imagery, never actually existed in the historical world we think we know so well? The story begins not in the dark alleys of some medieval city, but in the brilliant mind of Miguel de Cervantes, the Spanish author best known for creating Don Quixote. In 1613, Cervantes published a collection of stories called Novelas Ejemplares, or exemplary novels. Among these tales was one called Rinconete y Cortadillo, which told the story of two young rogues who encounter an organized criminal society in the Spanish city of Seville. In Cervantes' fictional world, this criminal organization operated much like a legitimate guild. It had a recognized leader, established territories, formal initiation procedures, and even its own code of honor. The thieves paid dues to their organization, followed established rules about how and when to operate, and maintained a complex hierarchy that governed their illegal activities. It was a brilliant piece of creative writing that brought order and structure to the chaotic world of urban crime. But Cervantes was writing fiction, creating an entertaining story that played with the contrast between legitimate guild organization and illegitimate criminal activity. His Thieves' Guild was a literary device, a way of exploring themes about honor, society, and human nature. He never intended for readers to believe that such organizations actually existed in the real world. Yet somehow, over the centuries that followed, this fictional creation began to take on a life of its own. Later, writers borrowed the concept, expanding on Cervantes' original idea and treating it as if it were historical fact rather than literary invention. The romantic appeal of organized, honorable criminals proved irresistible to storytellers who found in the Thieves' Guild a perfect vehicle for adventures that combined danger with a certain moral ambiguity. To understand why the Thieves' Guild concept became so persistent, we need to examine what real medieval guilds actually were and how they functioned. Legitimate guilds were powerful economic and social institutions that dominated urban life throughout medieval Europe. These were associations of craftsmen, merchants, or service providers who banded together to protect their economic interests, maintain quality standards, and provide mutual support for their members. A typical guild, whether composed of blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, or merchants, operated with official recognition from local authorities. Guild members paid taxes, contributed to civic projects, and often played important roles in city government. They maintained guild halls where members could gather for meetings, celebrations, and business discussions. They established training programs for apprentices, set standards for craftsmanship, and regulated competition among their members. Guilds controlled who could practice their trade within city boundaries, what prices could be charged for goods and services, and how business should be conducted. They provided social services for members, including support for widows and orphans, assistance during illness or disability, and proper burial for deceased guild members. In many ways, medieval guilds functioned as early versions of professional associations, labor unions, and social insurance systems all rolled into one. The key point that distinguishes real guilds from fictional thieves' guilds is legitimacy. Medieval guilds operated with legal recognition and government approval. They were respectable institutions that contributed to social stability and economic prosperity. Guild membership was a mark of respectability and social status that brought both privileges and responsibilities. Criminal organizations, by contrast, could never achieve this kind of legitimacy. No medieval government would have officially recognized a guild of thieves, granted them legal monopoly over criminal activity, or provided them with the institutional support that legitimate guilds enjoyed. The very idea contradicts everything we know about medieval law, government, and social organization. This doesn't mean that medieval cities lacked organized crime. Historical records document numerous criminal networks, gangs of bandits, and groups of outlaws who cooperated in various illegal enterprises. Pirates formed crews with established hierarchies and codes of conduct. Bandits sometimes organized into larger groups that controlled particular territories or trade routes. Urban criminals might form temporary alliances for specific schemes or maintain ongoing relationships based on mutual benefit. But these criminal networks bore little resemblance to the structured, legitimate institutions that the guild system represented. Criminal groups operated in secret without legal recognition or social acceptance. They lacked the institutional permanence, formal training programs, and civic responsibilities that characterized real guilds. Most importantly, they could never achieve the respectability and social integration that made legitimate guilds such powerful forces in medieval society. The appeal of the Thieves' Guild concept lies partly in its resolution of an inherent contradiction. Real criminal organizations face constant tension between the need for secrecy and the benefits of cooperation. Too much organization makes them visible to authorities, while too little organization limits their effectiveness. The fictional Thieves' Guild solves this problem by imagining criminals who somehow achieve both legitimacy and illegitimacy simultaneously. Archaeological and historical evidence supports the conclusion that formal thieves' guilds never existed. Medieval legal documents contain extensive records of guild activities, regulations, and disputes, but nowhere in these detailed archives do we find evidence of officially recognized criminal organizations. Court records document individual crimes and occasional criminal conspiracies, but they reveal nothing resembling the structured, ongoing institutions that the Thieves' Guild concept requires. Medieval literature, aside from Cervantes' original fiction, contains remarkably few references to organized criminal guilds. If such institutions had actually existed, we would expect them to appear more frequently in contemporary accounts, legal documents, and other historical sources. Instead, references to thieves' guilds in medieval literature are either clearly fictional or demonstrably derived from later sources influenced by Cervantes' original story. Economic analysis also argues against the historical existence of thieves' guilds. Legitimate guilds succeeded because they provided real economic benefits to their members and to society as a whole. They improved product quality, reduced transaction costs, provided training and social services, and created stable market conditions that benefited both producers and consumers. Criminal organizations, by definition, cannot provide these kinds of positive economic benefits. They create costs rather than value, making society poorer rather than richer. The guild system worked because it aligned individual interests with collective benefits. A guild member who maintained high standards and followed established rules contributed to the reputation and success of the entire organization, which in turn benefited all members. Criminal organizations face the opposite dynamic. Criminal success often depends on betraying partners, violating agreements, and pursuing individual advantage at the expense of group cohesion. Social analysis reveals additional problems with the Thieves' Guild concept. Medieval guilds were deeply integrated into the social fabric of their communities. Guild members participated in religious festivals, contributed to charitable activities, and played respected roles in civic life. They built guild halls that became important architectural landmarks and sponsored public works that benefited entire communities. Criminal organizations cannot achieve this kind of social integration. By definition, they operate outside accepted social norms and legal boundaries. While individual criminals might sometimes enjoy folk hero status, criminal organizations as institutions could never gain the broad social acceptance that legitimate guilds required for their success. The persistence of the Thieves' Guild myth reveals something interesting about human psychology and storytelling preferences. We seem drawn to narratives that combine familiar social structures with exciting transgressions of normal rules. The Thieves' Guild offers us the comfort of recognizable organization combined with the thrill of criminality and rebellion. Modern fantasy literature and gaming have further entrenched the Thieves' Guild concept by treating it as a standard element of medieval settings. Role-playing games, fantasy novels, and historical fiction routinely include thieves' guilds without questioning their historical authenticity. These modern treatments have created a feedback loop where fictional elements become so familiar that they feel historically accurate. The confusion between historical fact and literary fiction reflects broader challenges in understanding medieval history. Popular culture has shaped our expectations about medieval life in ways that sometimes conflict with historical evidence. The Thieves' Guild joins other persistent myths about medieval times, that people rarely bathed, that everyone believed the earth was flat, that life expectancy was uniformly short, or that medieval society was uniformly brutal and backward. Contemporary criminal organizations do sometimes develop guild-like characteristics, but they operate in fundamentally different legal and social contexts than medieval criminals faced. Modern organized crime groups can sometimes achieve quasi-legitimate status through corruption, intimidation, or operation in regions where government authority is weak. Medieval criminals lacked these opportunities because medieval governments, despite their limitations, maintained much more direct control over guild recognition and urban economic activity. Understanding why thieves' guilds never existed historically helps us appreciate both the creativity of fictional world-building and the complexity of real medieval social institutions. Cervantes created something genuinely innovative when he imagined criminals operating with guild-like organization. His fictional creation has proven so compelling that it continues to influence popular imagination more than 400 years after its creation. The myth of the Thieves' Guild also illustrates how fiction can sometimes seem more plausible than reality. The chaotic, unorganized nature of most historical criminal activity lacks the narrative satisfaction of well-structured illegal organizations. We prefer stories where even criminals follow recognizable rules and maintain predictable hierarchies, even though real criminal behavior is typically much more chaotic and opportunistic. In our journey through medieval mysteries, the Thieves' Guild serves as a reminder that not all historical questions have dramatic answers. Sometimes the most interesting discovery is that something we assumed was historical fact turns out to be pure fiction. The medieval world was quite mysterious and complex enough without needing to add imaginary criminal institutions to make it more interesting. The real medieval world of crime and law enforcement, guild organization and urban life offers plenty of genuine mysteries and fascinating stories. By understanding what actually existed, we can better appreciate both the achievements of medieval civilization and the creative imagination of writers like Cervantes, who gave us compelling fictional alternatives to historical reality. Imagine the tranquil walls of a medieval convent where the rhythms of daily life have remained unchanged for generations. The soft whisper of prayers echoes through stone corridors, candles flicker before religious icons, and the gentle scratch of quill pens marks the copying of sacred texts. This is a world of contemplation and devotion, where women have chosen lives of spiritual dedication far removed from the chaos and violence of the outside world. Now imagine that same peaceful sanctuary suddenly erupting into scenes of inexplicable madness. Picture nuns abandoning their prayers to chase each other through cloistered halls, their faces twisted with an animalistic compulsion to bite and attack their sisters. Imagine the horror of witnessing devout women who had spent years in quiet meditation, suddenly overcome by an irresistible urge to sink their teeth into human flesh. This nightmare scenario actually occurred in convents across late 15th century Europe, beginning in German religious houses before spreading like wildfire through France and Italy. What started as isolated incidents of bizarre behavior quickly escalated into full-scale epidemics of biting mania that baffled church authorities and terrified local populations. For months at a time, entire convents would descend into chaos as nuns became consumed by an inexplicable compulsion to bite each other. The phenomenon first appeared in German convents sometime in the 1470s, though exact dates remain uncertain because many religious houses were reluctant to document what they saw as shameful episodes. The earliest reliable accounts describe small groups of nuns who suddenly began exhibiting strange behaviors during prayer services or communal meals. Without warning, a previously calm and devout sister would leap upon a companion and attempt to bite her neck, arms, or face. What made these incidents particularly disturbing was their contagious nature. Within hours or days of the first attack, other nuns would begin displaying similar symptoms. The biting compulsion seemed to spread through convents like a physical disease, affecting increasing numbers of sisters until entire communities were engulfed in frenzied chaos. Some accounts describe convents where 50 or more nuns simultaneously succumbed to the biting mania, creating scenes of such disorder that local authorities had to intervene. The affected nuns displayed remarkably consistent symptoms across different locations and time periods. Witnesses described women who suddenly abandoned their normal behaviors and began crawling on all fours, making animal-like sounds, and showing an overwhelming urge to bite anyone within reach. They seemed to lose their capacity for rational speech, communicating instead through growls, hisses, and other non-human vocalizations. During these episodes, the nuns appeared to be in altered states of consciousness. They showed no recognition of their religious duties, no awareness of their surroundings, and no memory of their previous lives as devout Christians. Some observers reported that the affected women seemed to believe they had been transformed into wild animals, particularly wolves or dogs. They would snap at anyone who approached them and had to be physically restrained to prevent them from injuring themselves or others. Church authorities initially interpreted these outbreaks as supernatural in origin. Some bishops declared that the convents had been invaded by demons who possessed the nuns and forced them to behave like beasts. Exorcists were summoned to drive out the evil spirits, and elaborate religious ceremonies were performed to purify the contaminated religious houses. Holy water was sprinkled throughout the affected buildings, prayers were recited continuously, and sacred relics were brought in to combat the demonic influence. Other religious leaders proposed different supernatural explanations. Some suggested that the nuns had been cursed by witches who resented their holy lives and sought to corrupt their pure souls. Others theorized that the women had somehow offended God and were being punished for hidden sins or lapses in devotion. These interpretations led to investigations of the affected nuns' spiritual lives, with church officials searching for evidence of heretical beliefs or immoral behaviors that might have triggered divine wrath. The geographic spread of the biting epidemic followed patterns that seemed to support neither demonic possession nor divine punishment theories. The phenomenon appeared first in German convents, then spread westward through Alsace and into France, eventually reaching Italian religious houses. This progression suggests transmission through human contact rather than supernatural intervention. Traveling priests, Visiting relatives or correspondence between convents might have carried whatever was causing the outbreaks from one religious community to another. The social context of late 15th century convent life provides important clues about why these episodes occurred when and where they did. Medieval convents were often overcrowded institutions housing women from diverse social backgrounds under conditions of strict discipline and limited personal freedom. Many nuns had not chosen religious life voluntarily but had been placed in convents by families who could not afford dowries for marriages or who needed to reduce the number of dependents in their households. Daily life in these religious communities was highly regimented, with every hour scheduled for specific activities: prayer, work, meals and sleep following unchanging patterns year after year. Nuns had little privacy, minimal contact with the outside world, and few opportunities for individual expression or personal relationships. They lived under constant surveillance by their superiors and faced severe punishment for any deviation from prescribed behaviors. These conditions created environments ripe for psychological stress and emotional instability. Modern mental health professionals recognize that isolated, high-stress communities with rigid social hierarchies and limited outlets for individual expression are particularly vulnerable to mass hysteria and other forms of group psychological disorders. The medieval convent, with its combination of social isolation, authoritarian control, and suppressed individual desires, represented an almost perfect breeding ground for collective mental health crises. The biting behavior itself may have represented a form of rebellion against the extreme constraints of convent life. Unable to express their frustrations, desires, or individual personalities through normal channels, some nuns may have unconsciously chosen behaviors that were so shocking and disruptive that they could not be ignored or easily suppressed. Biting attacks allowed women who were normally required to be gentle, submissive, and self-controlled to express aggression and assert physical dominance over their companions. The contagious nature of the episodes suggests psychological rather than supernatural transmission. When one nun began exhibiting bizarre behaviors, others may have unconsciously recognized an opportunity to express their own suppressed emotions and frustrations. The biting mania provided a temporary escape from the rigid constraints of religious life, a socially acceptable form of madness that allowed women to abandon their prescribed roles without being held fully responsible for their actions. Medical knowledge of the late 15th century had no framework for understanding psychological disorders or mass hysteria. Physicians of the era focused primarily on physical ailments and believed that mental disturbances were caused by imbalances in bodily humors or supernatural influences. They had no concept of psychological stress, social pressure, or group dynamics as factors that could produce mental illness. Some contemporary medical authorities did attempt naturalistic explanations for the biting epidemics. They proposed that the nuns had been poisoned by contaminated food or water, possibly through ergot fungus that sometimes infected grain supplies. Ergot poisoning can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and bizarre behaviors that might superficially resemble the symptoms reported in the affected convents. However, ergot poisoning typically produces additional symptoms like severe headaches, burning sensations in the extremities, and digestive problems that were not reported in the convent outbreaks. More importantly, ergot poisoning affects individuals randomly based on how much contaminated grain they consume, while the biting epidemics showed clear patterns of psychological contagion that spread from person to person through social contact. Other physicians suggested that the nuns were suffering from rabies contracted through animal bites, but this explanation also fails to account for the epidemic patterns and specific symptoms observed. Rabies does not spread through human contact, and its progression is quite different from the sudden onset and group nature of the convent outbreaks. The response of church and civil authorities reveals much about medieval attitudes toward mental illness and social disorder. Rather than seeking medical or psychological explanations, officials focused primarily on restoring order and preventing the spread of what they saw as spiritual contamination. Affected nuns were often separated from their communities, confined in isolation, or transferred to other institutions. Some authorities attempted to end the outbreaks through intimidation and punishment. Nuns who continued to exhibit biting behaviors were threatened with excommunication, physical punishment, or expulsion from their religious communities. These harsh measures sometimes succeeded in suppressing the symptoms temporarily, but they did nothing to address the underlying psychological pressures that had triggered the episodes in the first place. More enlightened church leaders recognized that punishment was ineffective and sought alternative approaches. Some bishops ordered improvements in convent living conditions, including better food, more comfortable quarters, and reduced restrictions on personal activities. Others arranged for affected nuns to receive spiritual counseling or to spend time in different environments away from their home convents. Interestingly, some of the most effective interventions involved changes in daily routines and social structures within the affected convents. When nuns were given more varied activities, increased opportunities for personal expression, or greater contact with the outside world, the biting episodes often subsided naturally. This suggests that the underlying cause was indeed related to the psychological stress of overly restrictive institutional life. The biting nun epidemics were not unique in medieval history. Similar outbreaks of mass hysteria occurred periodically in various closed communities throughout Europe. Dancing manias affected entire towns, with hundreds of people compulsively dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion. Laughing epidemics swept through schools and religious institutions. Trembling disorders caused groups of people to shake uncontrollably for days or weeks at a time. These various forms of mass hysteria shared common characteristics with the biting nun episodes. They typically occurred in communities under social stress, spread through psychological contagion rather than physical transmission, and involved behaviors that violated normal social expectations. They also tended to affect women more frequently than men, possibly because women in medieval society faced greater restrictions on personal expression and had fewer socially acceptable outlets for frustration and rebellion. Modern psychiatric understanding recognizes these historical episodes as examples of mass psychogenic illness, also known as epidemic hysteria or mass sociogenic illness. This condition occurs when psychological stress in a group setting produces physical symptoms that spread through social networks via suggestion and imitation. The symptoms are real and distressing to those who experience them, but they have psychological rather than physical causes. Contemporary examples of mass psychogenic illness help us understand how the medieval biting epidemics might have developed and spread. Modern cases have been documented in schools, workplaces, and other institutional settings where groups of people live or work together under stressful conditions. Symptoms can include nausea, dizziness, fainting, seizures, or unusual behaviors that spread rapidly through social contact and suggestion. The medieval biting nun epidemics remind us that mental health challenges have existed throughout human history, even when societies lacked the knowledge and tools to understand or treat them effectively. These episodes also illustrate how social conditions and institutional structures can contribute to psychological distress in ways that may not be immediately obvious to contemporary observers. The gradual disappearance of the biting epidemics in the early 16th century coincided with broader changes in European religious and social life. The Protestant Reformation challenged traditional Catholic institutions and practices, leading to reforms in convent life and greater scrutiny of religious communities. Improved understanding of human psychology and social dynamics, while still primitive by modern standards, provided alternative explanations for unusual behaviors that had previously been attributed to supernatural causes. Perhaps most importantly, changing attitudes toward women's roles and mental health created new frameworks for understanding and responding to psychological distress. While medieval society had few options for treating mental illness, Renaissance and early modern physicians began developing more sophisticated approaches to psychological disorders that recognized their complex social and individual dimensions. The story of the biting nuns serves as a fascinating window into medieval life, revealing the psychological pressures faced by women in restrictive religious institutions and the limited resources available for understanding and treating mental health crises. It reminds us that even in the most devoted religious communities, human nature found ways to assert itself against overwhelming social constraints, sometimes in the most unexpected and disturbing ways. Picture the greatest city in the ancient world at the height of its power. Rome in the year 100 of the Common Era was a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million inhabitants, its marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. its bustling forums filled with merchants from across the known world. Aqueducts carried fresh water from distant mountains, massive amphitheaters hosted spectacular entertainments, and roads radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, connecting this urban center to the farthest reaches of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Yet beneath this impressive facade lay a troubling economic reality that would seem almost impossible in our modern understanding of how societies function. Despite being the capital of the world's most powerful empire, despite its wealth and technological sophistication, Rome suffered from a chronic and seemingly inexplicable employment crisis. Archaeological evidence and historical records suggest that only 20 to 30% of adult male Roman citizens held regular productive employment at any given time. This statistic seems so extraordinary that it bears repeating. In the greatest city of the ancient world, roughly 7 out of every 10 adult men who possessed full citizenship rights lived without steady work. These weren't slaves or foreigners or temporary visitors, but full Roman citizens, the very people who were supposed to form the backbone of Roman society and the foundation of Roman military and economic power. How could such a situation arise in what we consider one of history's most successful civilizations? The answer lies in a complex web of economic, social, and political factors that created a unique and ultimately unsustainable urban environment. Rome's employment crisis wasn't the result of economic collapse or temporary hardship, but rather a structural feature of Roman society that persisted for centuries and may have contributed to the empire's eventual decline. The root of Rome's employment problem lay in its overwhelming dependence on enslaved labor. By the 1st century, millions of enslaved people worked throughout the Roman Empire, but their concentration was particularly heavy in Rome itself. These enslaved workers performed virtually every type of labor that free citizens might otherwise have undertaken: construction, manufacturing, domestic service, clerical work, teaching, medicine, and even skilled crafts like jewelry making and artistic decoration. Enslaved workers didn't just compete with free laborers for employment, they made free labor economically unviable in many sectors. Why would a Roman businessman hire free workers who demanded wages when he could purchase enslaved people who worked for nothing more than basic food, shelter, and clothing? The initial investment in purchasing enslaved workers was often quickly recouped through their unpaid labor, after which they generated pure profit for their owners. This economic logic created a vicious cycle that trapped both enslaved people and free workers in a system that benefited only the wealthy elite who could afford to purchase human beings. As more sectors of the Roman economy came to depend on enslaved labor, fewer opportunities remained for free workers to earn livings through productive employment. Free Roman citizens found themselves increasingly shut out of their own economy by a labor system that treated human beings as disposable property. The geographical concentration of enslaved workers in Rome itself exacerbated these problems. Wealthy Romans preferred to keep their enslaved households in the capital, where they could display their prosperity and enjoy the services of skilled workers. Large public construction projects employed thousands of enslaved laborers brought in specifically for these purposes. Private workshops and manufacturing facilities relied heavily on enslaved craftsmen who possessed skills that had been passed down through generations of bondage. The sheer scale of enslaved labor in Rome becomes clear when we consider that some wealthy households owned hundreds or even thousands of enslaved people. These weren't just domestic servants, but entire workforces that included administrators, accountants, teachers, doctors, architects, artists, and skilled craftsmen of every description. A single wealthy Roman family might possess the equivalent of a modern corporation's entire workforce, all working without wages and living as property rather than employees. Free Roman citizens who found themselves unable to compete with enslaved labor faced limited alternatives. Some turned to petty trade, selling small goods in the streets or operating tiny shops that served local neighborhoods. Others survived through casual labor, picking up occasional work as porters, messengers, or temporary assistants for various projects. Many relied on the generosity of wealthy patrons who provided food, money, or other support in exchange for political loyalty or social services. The Roman government recognized that having large numbers of unemployed citizens posed serious threats to social stability and political order. Hungry, idle crowds could easily turn into dangerous mobs that might threaten the peace of the city or challenge the authority of the ruling class. To prevent such unrest, Roman authorities developed an elaborate system of public welfare that provided free food and entertainment to the urban population. The famous phrase, "bread and circuses," captured the essence of this policy. The Roman government distributed free grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens, ensuring that even those without employment could obtain basic nutrition. At the same time, the state sponsored elaborate public entertainments including gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical performances, and religious festivals that kept the population occupied and distracted from their economic difficulties. This welfare system was remarkably sophisticated for its time, involving complex logistics for importing grain from Egypt and other provinces, massive storage facilities to maintain food supplies, and efficient distribution networks that could feed hundreds of thousands of people daily. The entertainment component was equally impressive, with the Colosseum and Circus Maximus hosting events that could accommodate audiences larger than any modern sports stadium. However, the bread and circuses system was fundamentally different from modern social welfare programs. Rather than helping unemployed citizens develop skills or find productive work, the Roman system simply maintained them in idleness. The goal wasn't to solve the employment crisis, but to manage its political consequences by keeping the unemployed population fed, entertained, and politically docile. This approach reflected the Roman elite's understanding of the urban masses not as potential workers or contributors to society, but as a potentially dangerous force that needed to be controlled and managed. The unemployed citizens of Rome weren't seen as people with unfulfilled potential or wasted human resources, but as a necessary burden that had to be borne to maintain political stability. The economic implications of supporting hundreds of thousands of non-productive citizens were enormous. The cost of importing grain, maintaining distribution systems, and funding public entertainments required massive government expenditures that had to be financed through taxation of the provinces. Roman citizens in the capital consumed resources produced by workers throughout the empire without contributing equivalent value through their own labor. This economic imbalance created what modern economists might recognize as a classic unsustainable system. Rome was consuming more than it produced, supporting its urban population through wealth extracted from conquered territories rather than through productive domestic economic activity. As long as the empire continued expanding and conquering new sources of wealth, this system could continue. But once expansion slowed or stopped, the economic foundations of Roman urban life would become increasingly precarious. The social consequences of mass unemployment were equally significant. A society where most citizens lived without productive work developed very different values and expectations than societies based on widespread employment. Roman culture came to view leisure as a mark of status and manual labor as degrading activity suitable only for enslaved people or social inferiors. This attitude created a feedback loop that made the employment crisis even worse. As free labor became associated with low social status, fewer Roman citizens were willing to engage in productive work even when opportunities existed. Working with one's hands came to be seen as shameful for anyone who could afford to avoid it. This cultural shift made it increasingly difficult to develop economic alternatives to enslaved labor or to create employment opportunities that free citizens would be willing to accept. The military implications of having large numbers of unemployed citizens were both positive and negative for Roman power. On one hand, idle urban populations provided a ready source of recruits for the Roman legions. Men with no economic prospects were often eager to join the army, which offered regular pay, opportunities for advancement, and the possibility of land grants upon retirement. On the other hand, a citizenry that had grown accustomed to receiving free food and entertainment without working developed expectations that were difficult to maintain during times of crisis. When external threats required increased military expenditures, or when conquered territories could no longer provide sufficient tribute, the Roman government faced the challenge of maintaining urban welfare systems that had become essential for political stability. Regional variations within the Roman Empire highlight how unusual the capital's employment situation was. In provincial cities and rural areas, free labor remained much more common because enslaved workers were less concentrated and expensive to maintain. Small farmers, local craftsmen, and regional merchants continued to earn livings through productive work. The employment crisis was primarily a phenomenon of Rome itself, where the concentration of wealth and enslaved labor created unique economic distortions. Archaeological evidence from Roman shops, workshops, and residential areas provides physical confirmation of the historical sources describing widespread unemployment. Excavations reveal that many areas of the city had far fewer production facilities than would be expected in a normal urban economy. Instead, archaeologists find evidence of residential areas filled with apartment buildings housing people who apparently had no regular employment but still managed to obtain food and other necessities. The contrast with contemporary cities in other parts of the ancient world is striking. Alexandria, Antioch, and other major urban centers showed much higher levels of productive economic activity relative to their populations. These cities had thriving markets, numerous workshops, and evidence of widespread employment in various trades and crafts. Rome's economic profile was unusual even by ancient standards. Some historians argue that the Roman employment crisis contributed directly to the empire's eventual collapse. A society that depends on imported wealth to support large numbers of non-productive citizens becomes vulnerable when external sources of wealth disappear. As the Roman Empire faced increasing military pressures and declining territorial expansion in the 3rd and 4th centuries, maintaining the urban welfare systems became increasingly difficult. The barbarian invasions that eventually overwhelmed the Western Roman Empire may have succeeded partly because Roman society had lost the economic vitality and social cohesion that comes from widespread productive employment. A citizenry that had grown accustomed to leisure and dependency may have been less motivated to defend institutions that provided them with material benefits, but no sense of meaningful participation or contribution. Modern parallels to Rome's employment crisis are often drawn but should be approached with caution. While some contemporary societies face challenges related to technological unemployment, changing labor markets, and social welfare systems, the specific conditions that created Rome's situation were unique to the ancient world's acceptance of enslaved labor and imperial exploitation. However, the Roman experience does offer relevant lessons about the relationships between work, social stability, and economic sustainability. Societies that develop large populations of economically marginal citizens face ongoing challenges in maintaining social cohesion and political legitimacy. The Roman solution of bread and circuses provided temporary stability, but at the cost of long-term economic health and social vitality. The psychological and cultural effects of widespread unemployment in Rome created lasting changes in how Romans understood work, leisure, and social status. These changes influenced Roman literature, philosophy, and political thought in ways that continued to shape Western civilization long after the empire's collapse. The Roman experience reminds us that economic systems have profound cultural consequences that extend far beyond immediate material conditions. Understanding Rome's employment crisis helps explain many seemingly contradictory aspects of Roman civilization. How a society that built magnificent public works could tolerate widespread idleness among its citizens, how an empire that conquered the known world could develop economic structures that ultimately undermined its own foundation, and how a culture that celebrated civic virtue could create conditions that discouraged productive citizen participation in economic life. The strange case of Roman unemployment ultimately reveals the complex relationships between political power, economic organization, and social stability that continue to challenge human societies today. Rome's experience suggests that even the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations can develop internal contradictions that undermine their long-term viability, often in ways that are invisible to contemporary observers who focus on outward signs of strength and prosperity rather than underlying structural weaknesses. In the misty realm where history meets legend, few figures capture our imagination quite like the Viking warriors who sailed from Scandinavia to reshape the medieval world. Among these fierce seafarers, one name stands out not just for his military prowess, but for the mystery that surrounds his very identity. Ivar the Boneless, leader of the great heathen army that conquered much of England in the 9th century, remains one of history's most enigmatic figures, a man whose unusual nickname has puzzled scholars for over 1,000 years. The story begins in the year 865, when the largest Viking force ever assembled descended upon the shores of East Anglia. This wasn't a typical raiding expedition seeking quick plunder and a swift return home. The Great Heathen Army, as English chroniclers called it, came to stay. They brought horses, supplies, and most importantly, a unified command structure under leaders who planned not just to raid English kingdoms, but to conquer and settle them permanently. At the head of this formidable force stood 3 brothers, sons of the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok. Their names echo through medieval chronicles and Norse sagas: Halfdan, Ubba, and the most famous of all, Ivar, known by the curious epithet, the Boneless. While his brothers are remembered primarily for their military campaigns, Ivar has captured historical imagination because of the puzzle surrounding his unusual name and the conflicting accounts of his physical condition. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our most reliable contemporary source for these events, mentions Ivar repeatedly as a key leader of the Viking forces that swept through England. The chroniclers describe him as a formidable military strategist whose tactical brilliance helped the Vikings achieve victory after victory against English kingdoms that had seemed secure just years before. Yet these same sources offer no explanation for his nickname, leaving later historians to speculate about its meaning. Norse sagas, written centuries after the events they describe, provide more colorful but less reliable accounts of Ivar's life and condition. Some of these stories suggest that he suffered from a physical disability that prevented him from walking normally, requiring him to be carried into battle on a shield or in a cart. Other accounts describe him as incredibly flexible, able to bend his body in ways that seemed almost supernatural, as if his bones were made of some more pliable material than ordinary human skeletons. The most dramatic saga accounts paint Ivar as a figure of almost mythical proportions, a man whose physical limitations somehow translated into extraordinary strategic genius. These stories describe him as the mastermind behind Viking campaigns, the brother who planned while Halfdan and Ubba fought, the calculating intelligence that turned a collection of Viking raiders into a disciplined army capable of conquering kingdoms. Modern historians and medical experts have proposed numerous theories to explain Ivar's nickname and the physical condition it might have described. One of the most widely discussed possibilities is osteogenesis imperfecta, a genetic disorder that affects bone formation and can result in bones that break easily and heal improperly. People with severe forms of this condition might indeed appear boneless to medieval observers unfamiliar with genetic disorders. Another medical theory suggests that Ivar might have suffered from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that can cause extreme flexibility and joint hypermobility. Individuals with this condition can sometimes bend their limbs in ways that appear impossible to people with normal joint structure. Medieval observers might have interpreted such flexibility as evidence that the person lacked normal bones. Some scholars propose that the nickname had nothing to do with physical disability at all, but derived from linguistic misunderstanding or deliberate metaphor. Old Norse poetry often used elaborate metaphors and wordplay that can seem puzzling to modern readers. Boneless might have been a poetic way of describing someone who was particularly cunning or flexible in their thinking rather than their body. The possibility of mistranslation also cannot be dismissed. Viking nicknames were often descriptive terms that reflected personal characteristics, accomplishments, or notable incidents. The original Norse term that became boneless in English might have had a different meaning that was lost or altered as stories passed from one language and culture to another over the centuries. Archaeological evidence provides frustratingly little help in solving the mystery of Ivar's condition. While we have discovered numerous Viking burial sites and artifacts from the 9th century, none can be definitively linked to Ivar himself. The location of his grave remains unknown, despite various claims and legends about burial sites in England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. What we do know with reasonable certainty is that Ivar was an exceptionally capable military leader whose strategic skills helped transform Viking warfare in England. Before the Great Heathen Army, Viking raids were typically hit-and-run affairs conducted by relatively small forces seeking portable wealth. Ivar and his brothers demonstrated that Viking forces could work together on a much larger scale, conquering and holding territory rather than simply raiding it. The tactical innovations associated with Ivar's campaigns suggest a mind that understood both the strengths and limitations of Viking military culture. Traditional Viking warfare relied heavily on individual courage and the psychological impact of fierce attacks by warriors who seemed to fear neither death nor pain. Ivar appears to have combined these traditional strengths with more sophisticated approaches to siege warfare, logistics, and political maneuvering. The Great Heathen Army's conquest of York in 866 demonstrates this strategic sophistication. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the fortified city, the Vikings exploited a civil war between rival English claimants to the throne of Northumbria. They allowed the English factions to weaken each other through fighting, then moved in to capture the city when both sides were exhausted. This kind of patient, calculated approach suggests a leader who thought several moves ahead rather than simply relying on Viking ferocity. Ivar's political skills were apparently as impressive as his military abilities. The Vikings didn't just conquer English territories, they managed to hold them and establish functioning governments that English subjects found acceptable. This required a degree of diplomatic finesse that went far beyond traditional Viking capabilities. Local populations had to be convinced that Viking rule offered advantages over their previous English rulers. The economic aspects of Ivar's campaigns also suggest careful planning and long-term thinking. Rather than simply looting conquered territories and moving on, the Great Heathen Army established systems for regular tribute collection that provided sustainable income for their forces. They negotiated agreements with English kingdoms that preferred to pay tribute rather than fight, creating a network of client states that provided both wealth and strategic depth. These achievements become even more remarkable if Ivar was indeed dealing with the physical limitations that his nickname might suggest. Leading a medieval army required not just strategic intelligence but physical presence and the ability to inspire warriors who valued martial prowess above all else. A leader who couldn't fight in the traditional manner would have needed exceptional charisma and demonstrated competence to maintain authority over Viking forces. The religious dimensions of Ivar's story add another layer of complexity to his legacy. The Great Heathen Army arrived in England during a period of Christian consolidation, when English kingdoms had largely abandoned their pagan roots in favor of Christianity. The Vikings represented not just a military threat, but a religious challenge, bringing with them worship of Odin, Thor, and other Norse gods that Christian English saw as demonic. Ivar and his brothers were perceived by English chroniclers not just as foreign invaders but as agents of spiritual darkness threatening Christian civilization. This religious context influenced how their stories were recorded and remembered, with Christian writers emphasizing the brutality and paganism of the Viking leaders while sometimes acknowledging their military effectiveness. The famous Blood Eagle execution attributed to Ivar in some sources reflects this religious dimension. According to later accounts, Ivar ordered this particularly gruesome form of execution for King Aelle of Northumbria, supposedly in revenge for his father Ragnar's death. While the historical accuracy of this story is questionable, it demonstrates how Ivar came to be remembered as a figure of almost supernatural cruelty and vengeance. The influence of Ivar's campaigns extended far beyond his own lifetime. The territories conquered by the Great Heathen Army became the foundation for the Danelaw, the portion of England where Viking law and customs prevailed for generations. Cities like York became major Viking commercial and cultural centres that influenced English development for centuries. The political fragmentation of England that resulted from Ivar's conquests inadvertently set the stage for the eventual unification of the country under Alfred the Great and his successors. The threat posed by Viking kingdoms in northern and eastern England forced the remaining English kingdoms to cooperate more effectively and develop more sophisticated military and administrative systems. Ivar's legacy in Scandinavian culture was equally significant. The success of the Great Heathen Army inspired subsequent Viking expeditions and helped establish the period of Viking expansion that would eventually reach from Greenland to Constantinople. The model of organized, large-scale Viking campaigns that Ivar helped develop influenced Viking activities throughout the North Atlantic world. Modern popular culture has embraced Ivar as a fascinating historical figure, though often with significant embellishment and fictional elaboration. Television shows, novels, and other media have portrayed him as everything from a brilliant but cruel mastermind to a tragic figure overcoming physical limitations through intellectual superiority. These modern interpretations reflect our continued fascination with the puzzle of his identity and condition. The scholarly debate about Ivar continues as historians and medical experts propose new theories about his nickname and its possible meanings. Archaeological discoveries occasionally provide new insights into Viking culture and warfare that might shed light on Ivar's methods and achievements, though the man himself remains elusive. DNA studies of populations in areas conquered by the Great Heathen Army have revealed the genetic legacy of Viking settlement, showing how Ivar's campaigns contributed to the ethnic and cultural mixing that shaped medieval England. These scientific approaches to historical questions offer new ways of understanding the long-term impact of figures like Ivar, even when traditional historical sources provide incomplete information. The mystery surrounding Ivar the Boneless ultimately reflects the broader challenges of understanding medieval history, particularly the history of cultures that relied primarily on oral tradition rather than written records. The gap between contemporary chronicles written by his enemies and later sagas composed by his cultural descendants creates a historical puzzle that may never be completely solved. Yet perhaps the enduring mystery is part of what makes Ivar such a compelling historical figure. In an age when we expect comprehensive documentation and clear explanations for everything, Ivar reminds us that the past still holds secrets and that some of history's most important figures remain partially hidden in the shadows between fact and legend. His story invites us to imagine the human reality behind the historical records, to wonder about the man who bore such an unusual name and achieved such remarkable success in reshaping the medieval world. Whether Ivar was a brilliant strategist overcoming physical limitations, a ruthless warrior whose nickname reflected some other characteristic, or something else entirely, his impact on medieval history is undeniable. The Great Heathen Army changed the course of English development and established Viking influence that lasted for generations. In the end, perhaps what matters most is not the exact meaning of his nickname, but the remarkable achievements that made him memorable enough for his name to echo through 1,000 years of historical imagination. In the shadows of popular imagination, a figure moves silently through the night, clad entirely in black, face masked except for piercing eyes that seem to see everything. This mysterious warrior possesses supernatural abilities, the power to vanish like smoke, to walk on water, to kill with a single touch. Armed with exotic weapons and ancient secrets, the ninja has become one of the most recognizable figures in modern entertainment, appearing in countless movies, television shows, video games, and comic books as the ultimate silent assassin. But what if almost everything we think we know about ninja is wrong? What if the black-clad, supernatural warrior of popular culture bears almost no resemblance to the historical reality of the people who actually carried that title in medieval Japan? What if the real ninja were not mysterious assassins at all, but rather practical intelligence agents whose work was far more mundane, though perhaps more genuinely important, than Hollywood would have us believe? The disconnect between popular ninja mythology and historical fact represents one of the most dramatic examples of how entertainment culture can completely transform our understanding of the past. The real ninja of medieval Japan lived in a world of political intrigue and military conflict that was fascinating enough without supernatural embellishment. Yet their true story has been almost entirely obscured by centuries of fictional elaboration. To understand who the historical ninja actually were, we must first set aside the dramatic imagery that dominates modern perceptions and examine the specific historical context in which these figures operated. The golden age of ninja activity occurred during Japan's Sengoku period, roughly from 1467 to 1600, an era of almost constant warfare between competing feudal lords known as daimyo. During this turbulent time, Japan was divided into numerous independent territories ruled by warlords who constantly schemed against each other for greater power and influence. Military technology was rapidly evolving, with firearms recently introduced by Portuguese traders beginning to change traditional samurai warfare. Political alliances shifted frequently, and information about enemy plans, troop movements, and defensive preparations became incredibly valuable. In this environment of uncertainty and conflict, successful military commanders needed reliable intelligence about their enemies. They needed to know when attacks were planned, what routes armies would take, how well fortifications were defended, and which supposedly loyal allies might be considering betrayal. Traditional diplomatic channels were often unreliable or compromised, making covert intelligence gathering essential for survival. The ninja emerged as specialists in this dangerous but crucial work. Far from being mystical warriors with supernatural powers, they were essentially professional spies and intelligence agents who used practical skills to gather information, conduct sabotage operations, and occasionally carry out targeted assassinations when political circumstances required them. The historical ninja were concentrated primarily in two mountainous regions, Iga Province and the adjacent Koga district in what is now central Japan. These areas provided natural advantages for people engaged in covert activities. The rugged terrain offered numerous hiding places and escape routes, while the relatively isolated location meant that ninja communities could develop specialized skills and maintain operational security away from the main centers of political power. Unlike the solitary figures of popular imagination, real ninja typically operated as part of organized networks that included entire families and communities. These groups maintained detailed knowledge of local geography, developed sophisticated communication systems, and trained new generations in the skills necessary for intelligence work. They were far more like modern intelligence agencies than like individual superhuman warriors. The practical skills that ninja actually developed were impressive in their own right, though quite different from the magical abilities attributed to them in popular culture. Real ninja needed to be expert observers who could gather detailed information about enemy activities without being detected. They studied human psychology to understand how to blend into different social environments and how to elicit information from targets without arousing suspicion. Physical skills were certainly important, but they focused on practical rather than supernatural abilities. Ninja needed to be excellent climbers who could scale walls and buildings to gain access to restricted areas. They had to be skilled swimmers capable of crossing rivers and moats under cover of darkness. They needed superior knowledge of wilderness survival techniques that would allow them to travel long distances through hostile territory without being captured. The weapons associated with ninja in popular culture often have little basis in historical reality. The iconic throwing stars or shuriken were actually quite rare and typically used more for distraction than for killing. When ninja did carry weapons, they usually preferred simple, practical tools that could serve multiple purposes and wouldn't immediately identify them as warriors if they were captured. Perhaps most importantly, successful ninja needed to be master actors capable of assuming different identities and social roles. They might pose as merchants, pilgrims, entertainers, or servants to gain access to enemy territory and gather intelligence. This required detailed knowledge of various trades and social customs, along with the psychological skills necessary to maintain false identities under pressure. The clothing associated with ninja in popular imagination also reflects modern fiction rather than historical fact. The all-black outfit that has become synonymous with ninja imagery was actually derived from traditional Japanese theater costumes rather than historical intelligence operations. Real ninja dressed to blend in with their surroundings and the social role they were playing, which meant wearing ordinary clothing appropriate to their assumed identity. When ninja did need to operate at night or in situations requiring concealment, they were more likely to wear dark blue or gray clothing that provided better camouflage than pure black. The goal was always to avoid detection, and solid black clothing could actually make a person more visible under certain lighting conditions than more subtle color choices. The historical record provides some specific examples of ninja operations that illustrate the practical nature of their work. During the siege of Odawara Castle in 1590, ninja were employed to gather intelligence about the castle's defenses and to spread disinformation among the defenders. They posed as servants, merchants, and other ordinary people to move freely within the besieged fortress and report back on military preparations. In another documented case, ninja were used to assassinate a military commander who was planning to betray his allies. Rather than employing exotic weapons or supernatural techniques, they simply poisoned his food during a diplomatic dinner. The operation succeeded because of careful planning and knowledge of the target's habits, not because of any mystical abilities. The decline of ninja as a significant force in Japanese politics came about through the same practical considerations that had originally made them important. As Japan moved toward political unification under Oda Nobunaga and his successors, the demand for covert intelligence operations decreased. Nobunaga was particularly hostile to ninja communities, viewing them as obstacles to his goal of centralized control. In 1581, Nobunaga launched a massive military campaign against the Iga province ninja strongholds. His forces systematically destroyed ninja bases, killed many of the most skilled operatives, and scattered the surviving communities. This campaign effectively ended the ninjas' role as an independent political force, though some individuals continued to work as intelligence agents for various feudal lords. One historical figure who bridges the gap between reality and legend is Ishikawa Goemon, a late 16th century outlaw who has often been described as a ninja in popular accounts. Goemon was indeed a real person who operated during the final decades of the ninja era, but his actual activities were quite different from later legendary accounts. The historical Goemon appears to have been a bandit leader who specialized in robbing wealthy merchants and corrupt officials. While he may have used some techniques associated with ninja training, his primary motivation seems to have been personal profit rather than political intelligence gathering. His capture and execution in 1594 marked the end of an era when such independent operators could successfully challenge established authority. The transformation of ninja from historical intelligence agents into supernatural warriors of popular culture began during Japan's Edo period, when the country was unified under Tokugawa rule and actual ninja activities had largely ceased. During this peaceful era, writers and entertainers began creating fictional stories about ninja that emphasized dramatic and supernatural elements rather than the mundane realities of intelligence work. These fictional accounts were further embellished during the 19th and 20th centuries as Japanese popular culture developed new forms of entertainment. Kabuki theater, woodblock prints, and later novels and films created increasingly elaborate ninja mythology that had little connection to historical reality. The process accelerated when ninja stories reached Western audiences and underwent additional transformation to meet the expectations of different cultural contexts. Modern martial arts schools have also contributed to ninja mythology by claiming to teach authentic ninja techniques, despite the fact that genuine ninja training methods were never systematically preserved or publicly taught. Many of these schools combine legitimate martial arts techniques with theatrical elements and modern innovations that create impressive demonstrations but bear little resemblance to historical ninja practices. The psychological appeal of ninja mythology is not difficult to understand. In an age of technological complexity and institutional bureaucracy, the idea of individuals who possess secret knowledge and extraordinary abilities offers an attractive fantasy of personal empowerment. Ninja represent the ultimate outsiders who operate by their own rules and achieve their goals through superior skill and knowledge rather than institutional authority. However, the real history of ninja offers its own compelling narrative that doesn't require supernatural embellishment. The historical ninja were people who succeeded in one of humanity's most challenging and dangerous professions through intelligence, preparation, and psychological insight. They developed sophisticated techniques for gathering information and conducting covert operations that influenced military and political outcomes across centuries of Japanese history. Understanding the reality behind ninja mythology also provides valuable insights into how societies develop and use intelligence capabilities. The ninja communities of medieval Japan created decentralized networks of skilled operatives who could adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining operational security. Their methods influenced later intelligence organizations and contributed to the development of modern espionage techniques. The geographical concentration of ninja activities in specific regions also reveals how local geography and social structures can shape the development of specialized skills and institutions. The mountainous terrain of Iga and Koga provided natural advantages for covert operations, while the political fragmentation of medieval Japan created market demand for intelligence services that sustained ninja communities for generations. From a broader historical perspective, the ninja phenomenon illustrates how societies in conflict develop innovative approaches to information gathering and covert operations. Similar intelligence specialists appeared in other cultures facing comparable challenges, though few achieved the same level of organization and effectiveness as the Japanese ninja communities. The legacy of historical ninja extends beyond their immediate military and political impact. Their emphasis on psychological skills, adaptability, and systematic observation influenced Japanese culture in ways that continue to be relevant today. Modern Japanese approaches to business intelligence, quality control, and strategic planning sometimes reflect principles that can be traced back to ninja methodology. The contrast between ninja reality and popular mythology also serves as a valuable reminder about the importance of distinguishing between historical fact and entertainment fiction. While there's nothing wrong with enjoying stories about supernatural warriors, understanding the difference between these stories and actual history enriches our appreciation of both fictional creativity and historical achievement. The real ninja were remarkable enough without supernatural powers. They were people who succeeded in gathering vital intelligence and conducting successful covert operations in one of history's most challenging political environments. They developed practical skills and organizational methods that influenced centuries of Japanese political development and contributed to the eventual unification of the country under centralized rule. Perhaps most importantly, the true story of ninja reminds us that history is often more interesting and instructive than the legends that grow up around it. The practical challenges faced by medieval Japanese intelligence agents and the creative solutions they developed offer insights into human adaptability and ingenuity that remain relevant in our modern world of global communication and technological complexity. In the end, the historical ninja deserve recognition not as supernatural warriors from fantasy stories, but as skilled professionals who made significant contributions to Japanese political development during one of the most dynamic and dangerous periods in the country's history. Their story, properly understood, is far more fascinating than any fictional elaboration could ever be. Imagine holding in your hands a piece of crystallized sunlight, a gemstone so magnificent that it once adorned the crowns of emperors and graced the courts of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Picture a diamond of extraordinary size and beauty, 137 carats of pure yellow brilliance that caught and reflected light like captured starfire. This was the Florentine diamond, also known as the Austrian yellow diamond, one of the most remarkable gems in human history and the subject of one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. For over 3 centuries, this extraordinary stone passed through the hands of royalty, survived wars and revolutions, and witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Yet in 1918, during the chaos that followed the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Florentine diamond simply vanished. Despite decades of searching by treasure hunters, historians, and law enforcement agencies across multiple continents, no confirmed trace of this priceless gem has ever been found. The story of the Florentine diamond begins in the mists of early modern European history, though its ultimate origins remain shrouded in uncertainty. Some accounts suggest that the stone was discovered in India, the source of most of the world's finest diamonds during the medieval and early modern periods. Others propose that it came from the legendary diamond mines of Golconda, which produced some of history's most famous gems, including the Hope Diamond and the Koh-i-Noor. What we know with greater certainty is that by the late 17th century, the diamond had found its way into the collection of the Medici family, the powerful banking dynasty that ruled Florence and played a central role in Renaissance politics and culture. The Medicis were renowned collectors of art and precious objects, and their treasure house contained some of Europe's most valuable gems, artwork, and curiosities. The diamond's association with Florence gave it the name by which it became known throughout European court circles. During its time in Medici possession, the stone was cut into a distinctive double rose shape with 126 facets, an unusual configuration that maximized its brilliance and fire. This cutting style was characteristic of the Baroque period, when gem cutters were experimenting with new techniques to enhance the optical properties of precious stones. The Florentine diamond's journey from Italian to Austrian possession reflects the complex political marriages and dynastic negotiations that shaped early modern European history. When the last Medici ruler died without direct heirs in 1737, the family's treasures were dispersed according to various inheritance agreements and political settlements. The diamond eventually came into the possession of the Habsburg dynasty, the imperial family that ruled the Austrian Empire and later the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Under Habsburg ownership, the Florentine diamond became one of the crown jewels of the Austrian imperial collection. It was incorporated into various ceremonial objects and jewelry pieces worn during important state occasions. The stone's distinctive yellow color made it particularly striking when worn against the rich fabrics and elaborate costumes favored by 18th and 19th century European courts. The diamond witnessed some of the most dramatic events in European history during its centuries in Austrian possession. It was present during the Napoleonic Wars, when Habsburg territories were invaded and occupied by French forces. It survived the revolutions of 1848, when republican movements threatened monarchical rule across Central Europe. It remained in imperial hands through the complex negotiations that created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary in 1867. Throughout these turbulent periods, the Florentine diamond retained its status as one of Europe's most prized gemstones. Visitors to the Habsburg court often remarked on its extraordinary beauty and size. Diplomatic correspondence from various European capitals includes references to the diamond as a symbol of Austrian imperial wealth and prestige. The stone appeared in official portraits of Habsburg rulers and was frequently mentioned in contemporary accounts of court ceremonies and celebrations. The technical specifications that made the Florentine diamond so remarkable reflect both the quality of the original stone and the skill of the craftsman who shaped it. At 137 carats, it was among the largest cut diamonds in the world, comparable in size to other famous stones like the Regent diamond in France and the Orlov diamond in Russia. Its yellow color was particularly unusual and valuable, as most large diamonds are either colorless or show less desirable tints. The double rose cut that gave the Florentine diamond its distinctive appearance was a complex technical achievement that required extraordinary skill from the gem cutters who created it. This cutting style involved creating multiple layers of triangular facets that caught and reflected light from many different angles. The result was a stone that displayed exceptional brilliance and fire, qualities that made it legendary among European gem collectors. The diamond's optical properties were enhanced by its unusual clarity and the precision of its cutting. Contemporary accounts describe how the stone seemed to glow with internal light, creating an almost magical effect that captivated everyone who saw it. The combination of size, color, clarity, and cutting made the Florentine diamond virtually unique among the world's great gemstones. As the 19th century progressed into the 20th, the Florentine diamond remained a treasured possession of the Habsburg imperial family, but the political foundations that supported their rule were beginning to crumble. The rise of nationalism among the various ethnic groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire created increasing internal tensions. Military defeats and economic difficulties weakened imperial authority and prestige. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the beginning of the end for the Habsburg dynasty and ultimately for the secure possession of their crown jewels. The war placed enormous strains on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which found itself fighting on multiple fronts against enemies that included Russia, Italy, and eventually the United States. Military casualties mounted, economic resources were exhausted, and internal political cohesion collapsed. By 1918, it was clear that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could not survive in its existing form. Emperor Karl, who had inherited the throne from Franz Joseph in 1916, found himself ruling over territories that were declaring independence and populations that no longer accepted Habsburg authority. The imperial government lost control over vast regions of the empire, and rival political groups began competing for power in the former imperial territories. It was during this chaotic period of political collapse that the Florentine diamond disappeared. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but the stone was apparently removed from its official storage location sometime during the final months of 1918. Whether it was stolen by opportunistic thieves, hidden by loyal imperial servants, or removed by members of the Habsburg family themselves, no one knows for certain. The confusion surrounding the diamond's disappearance reflects the broader chaos that accompanied the empire's collapse. Official records were destroyed or scattered, imperial treasures were looted or hidden, and many people who might have had knowledge of the diamond's fate were killed, fled, or chose to remain silent about events during this dangerous period. Various theories have been proposed to explain what happened to the Florentine diamond after its disappearance from official custody. One possibility is that the stone was smuggled out of Austria by Habsburg loyalists who hoped to preserve imperial treasures until political conditions stabilized. These loyal servants might have hidden the diamond in a secure location, planning to return it to the imperial family when circumstances permitted. Another theory suggests that the diamond was stolen by criminals who took advantage of the political chaos to loot imperial treasures. Professional thieves or opportunistic looters might have gained access to the imperial collection during the confusion of 1918, when normal security measures had broken down and government authority was in collapse. A third possibility is that the diamond was deliberately hidden or destroyed by members of the Habsburg family themselves. Faced with the loss of their empire and uncertain about their personal safety, the former imperial family might have decided to conceal their most valuable possessions rather than risk having them confiscated by new republican governments or stolen by criminals. Some researchers have suggested that the Florentine diamond was cut into smaller stones to make it easier to transport and sell. Large, distinctive gemstones are difficult to dispose of because they can be easily identified, while smaller stones can be sold more discreetly through various channels. If the original diamond was indeed cut up, this would explain why no trace of it has ever been found despite extensive searching. The search for the missing Florentine diamond has continued for over a century, involving professional treasure hunters, amateur researchers, law enforcement agencies, and academic historians. Various individuals have claimed to have located the stone or to possess information about its whereabouts, but none of these claims have been substantiated with convincing evidence. Insurance companies and auction houses maintain detailed records of valuable gemstones that appear on the market, hoping to identify the Florentine diamond if it ever surfaces for sale. International law enforcement agencies have issued alerts describing the stone's characteristics, and museum curators worldwide have been asked to watch for any gemstone matching its description. The technological advances of recent decades have provided new tools for searching for missing gemstones, but they have not yet succeeded in locating the Florentine diamond. Digital databases can now track the movement of valuable objects more effectively than ever before, and scientific techniques for identifying gemstones have become increasingly sophisticated. Yet despite these improvements, the diamond remains as elusive as ever. Modern gemological science has provided new insights into what makes the Florentine diamond so distinctive and valuable. Advanced understanding of crystal structure, optical properties, and cutting techniques helps explain why the stone was so highly prized and why it would be instantly recognizable to experts if it ever reappeared. These same scientific advances have made it more difficult for someone to pass off a different stone as the missing Florentine diamond. The economic value of the Florentine diamond, if it still exists, would be almost impossible to calculate accurately. Historical gemstones of comparable size and quality have sold for tens of millions of dollars at auction, but the Florentine diamond's unique characteristics, royal provenance, and mysterious history would likely make it even more valuable. Some experts estimate that the stone could be worth over $50 million in today's market. Beyond its monetary value, the Florentine diamond represents an irreplaceable piece of European cultural heritage. The stone witnessed centuries of imperial history, served as a symbol of dynastic power and artistic achievement, and embodied the sophisticated gem-cutting techniques of its era. Its loss represents not just the disappearance of a valuable object, but the destruction of a tangible link to the complex political and cultural world of pre-modern Europe. The mystery of the Florentine diamond also reflects broader questions about the fate of cultural treasures during periods of political upheaval. Wars, revolutions, and governmental collapses have resulted in the loss or destruction of countless irreplaceable artifacts throughout history. The diamond's disappearance serves as a reminder of how quickly centuries of accumulated cultural heritage can vanish during times of crisis. Various romantic theories about the diamond's current location continue to capture popular imagination. Some people believe it lies hidden in a secret vault, waiting to be rediscovered by future generations. Others suggest it might be in private hands, cherished by collectors who prefer to keep their ownership secret. Still others think it might have been incorporated into a different piece of jewelry, disguised beyond recognition. The persistence of interest in the missing Florentine diamond reflects humanity's fascination with lost treasures and unsolved mysteries. The combination of royal history, enormous value, and complete disappearance creates a perfect puzzle that appeals to our desire to solve seemingly impossible problems. The diamond has inspired novels, documentaries, and countless amateur investigations by people hoping to succeed where professional searchers have failed. Recent decades have seen renewed interest in the Florentine diamond mystery as new archival research has uncovered previously unknown documents related to the Habsburg crown jewels. Historians working in Austrian, Hungarian, and Italian archives have found correspondence, inventory records, and other materials that provide new insights into the diamond's history and possible fate. These archival discoveries have not yet revealed the diamond's location, but they have helped researchers develop more accurate timelines of events and identify previously unknown individuals who might have had access to the imperial jewels during the crucial period of 1918. This new information provides fresh leads for investigators and helps eliminate some theories about what might have happened to the stone. The story of the Florentine diamond ultimately reminds us that even the most precious and well-documented treasures can simply vanish, leaving behind only questions and speculation. In our age of global communication and sophisticated tracking systems, it seems almost impossible that such a distinctive and valuable object could remain hidden for over a century. Yet the diamond's continued absence proves that some mysteries resist even our most determined efforts to solve them. Whether the Florentine diamond still exists somewhere in the world, whether it was destroyed during the chaos of 1918, or whether it lies waiting in some forgotten hiding place, its story continues to captivate anyone interested in the intersection of history, mystery, and human ambition. Like the vanished Norse colonies of Greenland or the missing pages of ancient manuscripts, the Florentine diamond represents one of those tantalizing gaps in our knowledge that remind us how much of the past remains forever beyond our reach. As our journey through these strange histories comes to a gentle close, we find ourselves in a place that feels both familiar and mysteriously different from where we began. We've walked through empty Norse settlements in Greenland, where the wind still whispers through abandoned stone houses. We've sat at medieval tables discovering that peasant meals were far richer and more varied than we ever imagined. We've searched the shadows for thieves' guilds that existed only in the imagination of a brilliant Spanish storyteller. We've witnessed the inexplicable madness that seized medieval convents, watched the puzzling spectacle of an empire where most citizens lived without work, and pondered the mystery of a Viking leader whose very nickname continues to baffle scholars. We've separated the reality of Japanese intelligence agents from the supernatural warriors of popular culture, and we've traced the path of a magnificent diamond that simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing empire. Each of these stories has taken us to that fascinating borderland where facts end and questions begin, where the documented past gives way to speculation and wonder. These are the spaces between certainty and mystery, the quiet corners of history where our knowledge reaches its limits, and imagination must fill the gaps left by time and circumstance. What strikes us most profoundly about these tales is how they remind us that history is not a finished book with all its chapters complete and all its questions answered. Instead, it resembles a vast library where many volumes are missing pages, where entire sections remain unwritten, and where the most intriguing stories often exist in the margins and footnotes rather than in the main narrative. The Norse settlers of Greenland thrived for 4 centuries before disappearing so completely that we can only guess at what finally overwhelmed their resilient society. Their vanishing reminds us that even successful civilizations can reach tipping points where familiar strategies suddenly prove inadequate to new challenges. Climate change, cultural inflexibility, economic disruption, and social isolation combined in ways that we can analyze but never fully recreate or completely understand. Medieval peasants, we discovered, lived lives that were far more complex and varied than popular stereotypes suggest. Their sophisticated food culture, seasonal celebrations, and community cooperation systems reveal human societies that found ways to create meaning and sustenance even under conditions we might consider impossibly restrictive. Their story teaches us to question our assumptions about the past and to recognize the ingenuity that human beings have always brought to the challenge of survival. The myth of the Thieves' Guild showed us how fiction can sometimes seem more plausible than reality, how a single creative writer's imagination can reshape our understanding of entire historical periods. Miguel de Cervantes created something so compelling that it has influenced our perception of medieval crime for over 400 years, reminding us that the stories we tell about the past are often as important as the facts we can verify. The biting nuns of medieval convents suffered from conditions that we now recognize as mass psychogenic illness, but their experiences reveal the psychological pressures that could build within isolated, authoritarian communities. Their story demonstrates that mental health challenges have existed throughout human history, even when societies lacked the knowledge and tools to understand or treat them effectively. Ancient Rome's employment crisis forces us to confront the contradictions that can exist within even the most successful civilizations. A society that built magnificent public works while maintaining large populations of idle citizens created an economic system that was ultimately unsustainable, providing lessons about the relationships between work, social stability, and long-term prosperity that remain relevant today. Ivar the Boneless embodies the eternal tension between legend and history, between the desire for clear explanations and the reality of incomplete evidence. His story reminds us that some of history's most important figures remain partially hidden in the shadows, known through their achievements but mysterious in their personal reality. The historical ninja, revealed as practical intelligence agents rather than supernatural warriors, show us how popular culture can completely transform our understanding of the past. Their real story of organized espionage networks and strategic information gathering proves that historical reality is often more interesting than the myths that grow up around it. Finally, the vanished Florentine diamond represents all the treasures, both material and cultural, that have been lost to war, revolution, and the simple passage of time. Its disappearance reminds us that even the most precious and well-documented objects can simply vanish, leaving behind only questions and the faint hope that someday, somewhere, they might be found again. These stories share certain common themes that speak to fundamental aspects of human experience. They remind us that change is the only constant in human affairs, that societies which seem permanent and successful can face sudden challenges that test their adaptability. They show us that people have always found creative ways to respond to difficult circumstances, even when their solutions seem strange or inadequate by contemporary standards. They also demonstrate the importance of questioning accepted narratives about the past, of looking beyond familiar stories to discover more complex and interesting realities. Popular culture often simplifies historical complexity into easily digestible narratives, but the real past is usually far more nuanced and surprising than these simplified versions suggest. Perhaps most importantly, these strange histories remind us that mystery and uncertainty are not flaws in our understanding of the past, but essential features of the human condition. We are creatures who live in time, constantly moving forward into an uncertain future while trying to make sense of a past that remains only partially accessible to us. The gaps in our historical knowledge are not just unfortunate accidents caused by the loss of documents or the passage of time. They reflect the fundamental challenge of understanding complex human societies and the individual experiences of people who lived in very different circumstances from our own. Even when we have abundant evidence, interpreting that evidence requires us to bridge cultural and temporal distances that can never be completely overcome. This doesn't mean that historical research is futile or that all interpretations of the past are equally valid. Careful scholarship, rigorous analysis of evidence, and honest acknowledgement of uncertainty can help us develop increasingly sophisticated understandings of historical realities. But it does mean that humility and wonder should always accompany our investigations into the past. The strange histories we've explored together offer us something perhaps more valuable than complete knowledge. They provide us with a sense of connection to the long chain of human experience that stretches back through countless generations. The Norse settlers who watched their Greenland communities slowly decline, the medieval peasants who developed elaborate food preservation techniques, the nuns who succumbed to inexplicable compulsions, the Roman citizens who lived without regular employment, the Viking leader whose nickname puzzles us still, the ninja who gathered intelligence in dangerous times, and the royal families who lost their most precious treasures all faced challenges that required creativity, resilience, and hope. Their struggles and achievements, their successes and failures, their mysteries and certainties form part of the vast tapestry of human experience that includes our own lives and challenges. Understanding their stories, even incompletely, helps us recognize both the continuity and the change that characterize human existence across time and cultures. In our modern world of instant communication and seemingly unlimited access to information, it's easy to assume that all questions can be answered and all mysteries solved given sufficient time and resources. These strange histories remind us that some aspects of human experience will always remain partially hidden, that uncertainty and wonder are permanent features of our relationship with both the past and the future. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself imagining the empty houses of Greenland slowly being reclaimed by ice and time, or picturing medieval kitchens where families gathered around fires that have been cold for centuries. Maybe you'll wonder about the fate of a magnificent yellow diamond that once caught the light in imperial palaces, or ponder the reality behind legends of warriors whose true nature has been obscured by centuries of storytelling. These images and questions don't require answers to be meaningful. They connect us to the mystery and complexity of human experience, reminding us that we are part of a story that began long before our birth and will continue long after our death. In the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine, we find not emptiness but richness, not frustration but wonder. History, in the end, is not just about the past. It's about the eternal human effort to understand ourselves and our place in the great flow of time. These strange histories, with all their mysteries and unanswered questions, are part of that ongoing effort. They remind us that the most important truths are often found not in what we can prove with certainty, but in what we can glimpse in the shadows between the known and the unknown, between fact and possibility, between history and legend.